Could a book on politics in 2021, written by a Christian, actually cut through partisanship and division in our culture right now? Well, let's take a look. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, so I have here a copy of the new book by Daniel Williams, The Politics of the Cross. The subtitle is A Christian Alternative to Partisanship, which is a really interesting subtitle. Could something like this live up to that idea? Well, let's step through the main idea, the research, the readability, and the reasonableness of, at least as I see it, in a few minutes. So, the main idea of this book, it's pretty clear from the title, I think, is that he is trying to put forward a thicker, more complicated, more nuanced, more robust understanding of politics in America from an explicitly Christian perspective. So he's trying to also especially bring in a heavy dose of historical understanding to how both parties, Democrat and Republicans, have interacted with Christian ideas, particularly over the past century. So there's a chapter on each party and their history with Christianity. And then there are chapters on the really hot button issues, including abortion, marriage, and race, and topics like that. So he just dives right into all the kind of cultural lightning rods. And there's a chapter going into detail on each issue and talking about it explicitly through a lens of political engagement. So policies, laws, voting, how might a Christian approach thinking about these issues? And it really is not a partisan book. It talks about both parties, policy suggestions from both parties, and then he offers some judgments on which parties, how the different parties handle things, and how a Christian might try to analyze that through their own faith, moral perspective. So that's a pretty tall order, and it's not a super long book. It's not this big tome. So that's the main idea, is trying to cut through the partisan kind of bickering and the partisan kind of like party lines that people tend to line up on these issues, and instead pose what's a fulsome, robust Christian approach. The research behind it, so he is an historian. I had not read anything by him before, but I think I'm going to now because I'm really intrigued by his historical work. So he's an academic historian. He brings in quite a bit of history, particularly in the two chapters on the two parties, the history of the two parties. But there's also a ton of, a lot of articles. There's a lot of endnotes, so it's heavily footnoted throughout, so you can look at the sources pretty easily. But he talks a lot, he uses a lot of articles, news articles, for some of his discussions, and part of that's because he, in addition to giving his historical summaries of different policies and different approaches to issues, he also, he does discuss specific outcomes of specific policies, and he does get into details on a lot of economic information, actually, a lot of economic outcomes, class structure issues, the ways that certain policies have impacted the poor, tax policies, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of that kind of research. In addition to history, there's a lot of wonky policy research in it. So just know that going into it. It's well marked, but he does bring a lot of that data in. And that kind of leads into the readability. So that raises the question, is it readable or is it really dry and crunchy? I found it, I'm trying to nuance the way I talk about this because I want people to read this book. But it is a little bit of work to get through because, and it's a two-edged thing. He brings in data which strengthens the reasonableness of his case, which I'll get to in a second. So it's definitely data-backed. It's not just polemic opinion feelings, but that also makes it a little bit harder to get through. So just because there's a lot of numbers, and especially when he gets into the policy stuff. So know that that's in there. These things kind of go with each other. You can't have in my opinion, you can't have a good, nuanced take on these issues if there isn't research behind it, which also kind of maybe makes it a little harder to read. Now, okay, all that being said, I just made it sound like it's a slog. It isn't. I'm just trying to think of people who maybe don't approach these books that often, or who are used to just reading short news articles, who would probably be the people who really should read this book, honestly. If you read a lot of history, if you read a lot of academic stuff, this is going to be a breeze. It's not a heavy lift. But if you're not used to that stuff, it does get a little bit more into data than probably what your typical blogs or headline articles do. So just know that going into it. But that for me is actually a plus. I think that the work, the research he did, the data he brings into it, also while keeping the chapters relatively short. I mean, this is not a super long book, but that means that it's a little denser, right? The writing style is a little on the dense side. So know that going into it. But that should not dissuade you, because in terms of reasonableness, man, I love this book. I found it of my three kind of categories here. Reasonableness is like the highest mark I would give this. I think it's an extremely reasonable approach to an extremely divisive topic. I think it's pretty remarkable, actually, how he provided such a fully orbed take on so many issues. So yes, so I loved it in particular. So I love the historical angle, and I love that he talked historically about both parties. It's really interesting to see what threads of Christianity both Republicans and Democrats have kind of latched onto, and the way he frames that is really fascinating, especially because we typically only associate the Republicans with Christianity these days, but the Democrats have a legacy of kind of evangelical Christianity that has impacted some of their approach towards especially the poor and the working class in the history. So I really appreciated that, but in particular, I loved the chapter on the issue of abortion. That chapter in particular really impacted my own paradigm on that policy issue. So I'd highly recommend that chapter. If nothing else from this book, I mean, you should buy the book just to read that chapter on such an important discussion. But in general, I loved how he avoided simplicity, a simplistic approach. He avoided that at all costs. He also doesn't land on a, so therefore I think you should vote this way. Every chapter walks you carefully through all the nuances and then says, here are different ways Christians have made sense of this issue, and he leaves it open for the reader to think and to make their own decisions, but hopefully to do it in a way that's seasoned with more historical perspective and more detailed policy analysis. And man, I loved that. I loved the open-ended nature of that. But I know that might upset some people, because we live in a very simplistic kind of give me the prescription, give me the what to think kind of age. And it's tragic that that's where we live, and it's tragic that might be the very thing that people don't like about this, but because I think that's exactly what's needed. He is providing, I think Williams has provided here a tonic for our partisan age. That's part of why I wanted to feature it here, because I think that maybe people who've been watching my videos would really appreciate that about it. So at the end of the day, it's a remarkably thoughtful book. It's remarkably relevant for right now, for the issues that are the most pressing for our time. In that sense, it might get dated pretty fast. It might be really dated in 5 or 10 years. I don't know. I don't really care, because it's a book we need right now. So I had really high recommendation on this, The Politics of the Cross by Daniel Williams, a robust, thoughtful, nuanced, well-researched perspective for our time. So hope you found that helpful and interesting. If that sounds at all interest to you, man, go pick this up. Support what he's doing, because I appreciate his voice. Thanks for watching.